The old poisoner, Debussy called him. Whilst writing Pelléas, Debussy told Chausson that he kept having to tear up pages of the score because the ghost of old Klingsor kept appearing. Chausson actually spent his honeymoon at Bayreuth so that he could hear Parsifal. And at the performance of Tristan in 1889, Chabrier burst into tears, and Lecoeur fainted and had to be carried out. But for the moment, to the old poisoner himself and his Tristan und Isolde. In 1865 there was, as Victor Borger mischievously put it, a twin debut. The conductor Hans von Bülow had Wagner's Tristan premiere, and Mrs. von Bülow had Wagner's baby. Thoughtfully, she named it Isolde. If it had been anyone else but Wagner, said von Bülow, I would have shot him. John Steane is our reviewer this morning. Back in 1978, he had the same brief. Then there were only 4 recordings to choose from, spanning 20 years. Now there are 12, spanning 60.
Hot from the press, and probably still on its way to the shops, is a new recording under Daniel Barenboim on Teldec. We'll sample that first. The Berlin Philharmonic play with warmth and responsiveness in the prelude, as they do throughout. Then there's a fine voice to be heard from the young sailor up the mast. He's Uwe Heilmann. Singing from the crow's nest may be, but if so, then with a favourable wind in our direction. And then the women. One of the best of all Brandgainers in Mariana Lipovshek, and in Waltraud Meyer, an Isolde who has much of the needful range of mood, from brooding introspection to a tone of impulsive conversational mockery. Waltraud Meyer in the new Tristan under Barenboim. The Isolde who, out of all of them, to my mind, sounds as though she knows, really understands, just how depressing that voyage over the Irish Sea to Cornwall must have been, is Helga Dernisch. Isolde is a woman who's been taken essentially as a prisoner from homeland and family, for marriage to a man old enough to be her father, her country's former enemy. And sitting there, the agent of this hateful turn of events, is the man she holds responsible for her fiancé's death, and whose own life she once held in her hands. That goes deeper, I think, into the character and into the music. The orchestral tremolandos are not just accompaniment. They're the tense, shaking, nervous system of a woman in shock. The singer concentrates her imagination, feels the ebb and flow of the music, catches the flavour of words, as in that last phrase, in Scham und Scheuer abwärts schaut. As Tristan, in shame, she thinks, refuses to look her in the face, while the orchestra outlines the love glance motif, showing what's also at the back of her mind and adding to the pain. Dernesch captures all this, and hers is a very creditable part in the Karajan recording of 1972 on EMI. And of course it's a performance which is enriched by an extremely beautiful voice. But if it's beauty of voice you most insist on in your Isolde, then there are two supreme answers. One in the Kirsten Flagstad of 1936, whom we'll hear later, and the other, Margaret Price, in the Carlos Kleiber DG recording of 1982. Margaret Price, the most lovely singer among, at any rate, all of the relatively recent Isoldes. And as you heard, not just a beautiful voice. For instance, immediately after the love glance motif, heard now in full, there are the words, seines Elenders jammert mich, thinking back to her nursing of the wounded Tristan, recalling how, as their eyes met, she pitied his sufferings. The verb jammerte is taken to heart as a lament. You also heard there, briefly, the Brangena of Brigitte Fassbender. She's my favourite in the part, as much life in her as in all the others put together. That's the Carlos Kleiber recording. You can always recognise it before long, because you hear a great thump and know that it's the maestro putting his foot down. Now, we've heard three Isoldes, all strong in character and distinctive in appeal. Yet there's still another side to her, well, several other sides indeed. One, you might not believe it, is a sense of humour, albeit a bitter one, such as you get in this next excerpt, where she imagines Tristan trading her in to his king. A treasure she, this is the old Crébille translation, a treasure she, my liege and coz, what think'st thou of her for bride? This Irish jewel will I bring, for every stock and stone know I, a nod and I'll to Ireland fly, Isolde is your own, sire. And then follows the curse, Birgit Nilsson.
Ich
No wonder Brangainer's a trifle upset about all that. Nilsson, in a towering performance at Bayreuth in 1966 on Phillips. This is under Carl Böhm, and is the great recording for pace and punch, which doesn't preclude depth of feeling and even refinement. She was also the Isolde of an earlier recording under Schulte on Decca. This has had a rough ride among critics in recent years, and there are weaknesses enough for me to make it the first that I'll eliminate from a final choice. Yet it was an important and highly creative piece of record production, John Culshaw's, and it's easy to recapture the excitement that was felt on its first appearance in 1961. Alec Robertson, reviewing in the Grammophon, found it marvellous, as he said, to be listening at home to such a performance as this extraordinary, imaginative, and most successful venture, he called it. And with it, he said, this great, unique opera comes nearer to our minds and hearts than ever before. The end of Act 1, where the ship comes into port, the sailors rejoicing, the protagonists in the bewildering rapture of their newfound love. You can detect many of the features of modern operatic recording, dating back to that in 1960. The forward placing of the orchestra and relative subordination of the voices, the interest in details of text, the stage trumpets greeting King Mark, for instance, and the development of technical means to give them life. As I say, it's a recording that time has not been kind to. Some of the singing is rough, as you heard perhaps there, and Schulte's treatment of the score can be rough too. Nilsson was better, much better, at Bayreuth, and the Tristan, Fritz Uhl, often sounds like a poor little sparrow in a thunderstorm. A suitable Loga in Das Rheingold, I should think, a possible Lohengrin in not too big a house, but not a Tristan. And Tristan's labours in this opera, Herculean as they are, have hardly begun. Act 2. And first, a taste of a recording that has survived the years, the famous EMI version of 1952 with the Philharmonia Orchestra under Wilhelm Furtwängler, and with the 57-year-old Flagstad still magnificently bearing the torch of great Wagnerian singing. Flagstad with Furtwängler in 1952. And we can go back and hear her 16 years earlier, live from Covent Garden in her first season there in 1936. Here she is in that same passage as the horns of King Mark's hunting party recede into the distance and the longed-for meeting with Tristan draws near. Covent Garden, 1936. A performance under Fritz Reiner, now available on Video Artists International. Flagstad, so beautifully caught at the start there, is heard in the very prime of her voice. And in some ways I like her Isolde there more than in what was probably her artistic prime, for she lightens some of the phrases magically and produces the voice of a woman lit by the happiness of love. I'll come back to this recording in a moment, but first, just a word about various stage performances from this first half of the century. A reminder that I'm talking about only those in front of me here and now. That is, I'm not taking in the whole field of pirated recordings, nor of famous excerpts, such as the Leider Melchior love duet, nor of recordings, such as the first Bayreuth of 1928, that are not currently available. There is, newly available on the Orfeo label, a version from Munich in 1950 under Hans Knappertsbusch. I'm afraid I don't greatly enjoy the singing in this, though some have written warmly about it. Helena Brown is the Isolde, meaning everything she sings, that's true, but with a tendency to scoop, and often sounding worn on top. And Gunther Treptow, the Tristan, is at best a mixture, sometimes a genuinely attractive romantic and tragic hero, sometimes throaty, and in Act 3 resorting to the shout. They have a distinguished but superannuated Brangäna, Margareta Klose, often downright bad, but, and it's a big but, returning to form in the offstage solo of Act 2, where Brangäna, keeping watch, warns the lovers of their danger, while the rapturous music of the orchestra shows how little they care. You'll also hear how lovingly Knappertsbusch helps to shape the phrases, nourish the texture, and support the singer. Margareta Klose, the most sumptuous-voiced Brangäna, in that off-stage solo, live from Munich under Knappertsbusch in 1950. The other three live recordings I have here all have Flagstad as their Isolde. And with her is, by general consent, the greatest Wagnerian tenor of the century, Lauritz Melchior. Not without his faults, as we know, but still singing as we've heard no other in this music. And not merely singing. There's a spiritual quality quite remarkable, both in the long death of Act 3 and in the long dying of the love duet in Act 2. Melchior and Flagstad, from Covent Garden in 1936, Reiner conducting. And I have to say that the greatest single pleasure I've had in playing all of these recordings this time round has been in that. It's beautifully transferred to CD by Ward Marston, whose name is generally as good a guarantee as you can have. I'd forget the EMI muddle of Beecham and Reiner in their fascinating but ill-fated venture, and certainly forget the dry, loveless recording from the Met, New York, in 1940 under Erich Leinsdorf. But this one, under Reiner, an inspired conductor, I think, here, is to my mind very moving indeed, despite the obvious deficiencies in balance and so on. And I can't leave it without a brief hearing of the Kurvenal, here in Act 3. I've never heard one to match him, even Fischer-Dieskau in the Furtwängler set. For example, Tristan asks whether he's in Cornwall, and in his answer, Kurvenal, who's told him already where he is, has in this singer such a tender mixture of pity and love and patience in his voice, and then helping to jolly things along with something almost like a joke. How did you come here? Well, you didn't come on horseback, I can tell you that. You came here by ship, and you got to the ship on my shoulders. Herbert Janssen.
Christoph in Cario. Sie kam nicht her. Halt nun, wie du kamst, zurücktretest du nicht, ein Schifflein führte dich her. Doch zu dem Schifflein, die auf den Schultern flog, ist nicht. Ich bin Zeit, ich flog nicht fort zum Strand. Noch bist du daheim, daheim, Land, in Estland,
Herbert Janssen, the Kurvenal, of this 1936 live recording from Covent Garden with Flagstad and Melchior under Fritz Reiner. Now, this has brought us to Act 3, and to a very special and memorable recording, which I hope nobody thought I was going to forget. This is a mid-price Decca recording, and the one in which I think one is most aware of a deep, intense and loving concentration on the part of the conductor. It's the Welsh National Opera Orchestra under Reginald Goodall, completed in 1981. Not fully appreciable out of context, this quality of the conducting is a pervasive strength, and it's felt essentially as purposeful vigour. Hear him build this passage with his tenor, John Mitchinson, culminating in Tristan's curse upon the light of day. It's a performance in which the conductor's is a voice, as personal as any of the singers. And the singers, though not the internationally acclaimed names of the other sets, do sing. John Mitchinson there is probably more scrupulous in giving full singing value to his notes than any of them. There's a more true singing style, for instance, than in Kleiber's René Kollo or Bernstein's Peter Hofmann. Siegfried Jerusalem, in the new Barenboim, does sing scrupulously. But then, to take up a different point, all four of these, and as it happens they're the four most recent, fail to get pain in the voice, as Melchior did, or as John Vickers most strikingly did, and Wolfgang Windgassen too. Here's this same passage on stage at Bayreuth in the Böhm recording. Windgassen with Böhm. Less responsive to detail in the score than Goodall, or than the other conductors mentioned just now, but there's a very compelling dramatic life in that recording, and it's one I'm going to keep in reserve. We really ought now to be thinking of choice, and, as a preliminary, of eliminations. It's a bit hard on the Bernstein recording on Phillips, I fear, that it should come into view now only in time to be rejected. The Isolde is Hildegard Behrens. Plenty of insight, but particularly in Acts 2 and 3, wanting firmness of voice. Peter Hofmann, the Tristan, is likeable in lyrical moments, but doesn't carry much in the way of feeling. And nor does Hans Zottin's magnificently sung King Mark, though there's a sympathetic Brangäna in Yvonne Minton. But it's the insistency of very slow tempi that gets me down. Here, from the Love Duet, is an example of the recording at its best and its worst. It's at its best there in that the singers, Behrens and Hofmann, preserve the beauty of line and tone. At its worst in that the slowness is so willful, the orchestra made to purr, the conductors stroking that of the self-pleasing sensualist. Preferable, I think, is the pacing of the love music in the new recording under Barenboim. A sample from an earlier passage.
All
Care for detail of orchestration there, as well as the surge of passion, and very decent singing by Meyer and Siegfried Jerusalem. Not perhaps very charismatic lovers as recorded, but this is a fine recording under Barenboim, and I think will stand the test of time. But I'm wary of such prophecies, because last time, many years ago, when there were only 4 versions on the market, I chose the Carry-An, ending with the fateful words, "It is a Tristan to live with." Well, I'm afraid I've found otherwise. It's a very remarkable recording, not one to ignore, but there are irritations. The special effects acoustic Carry-An and his engineers use in that particular passage being one of them. And John Vickers, a great Tristan, no doubt, produces vowel sounds, open high notes and so forth that I now find I don't want to hear. If you heard a sort of munching sound from the studio just now, it must have been the eating of words. So, choices. Now that there are not 4, but a dozen. Could you, I wonder, be tempted by a package of 2? 2 that are of 3 discs each instead of the usual 4, and that complement each other rather well. Carl Böhm's Bayreuth 1966 performance with Nilsson and Windgassen, mid-price on Philips, is one of the strongest in character and drive. But I'd couple it with a recommendation for another live recording, Covent Garden 1936 under Fritz Reiner. This is with Flagstad in her first London season, Melchior and Janssen, and although it obviously won't do on its own as the library's one lonely Tristan, it's a marvellous performance, and as I said, gave me personally the greatest pleasure of all. But now, if it has to be a single set, I think about the Barenboim, but rather more earnestly about Kleiber, Goodall, and Furtwängler. Carlos Kleiber conducts with devotion, the Dresden Orchestra playing beautifully for him, and with Margaret Price as the loveliest of all Isoldes. The radiance of that Leuchtet is almost enough to send you out to buy it on the spot. There's also the outstanding Brangena of Brigitte Fassbender. Fischer-Dieskau by then, that's 1982, was a distinctly aging Kurvenal. Kurt Moll, a fine singing but not very expressive King Mark, and René Collot's Tristan, resourceful as it is, doesn't match Price's Isolde, which also has its limitations. She's a princess with authority, but it's difficult for a voice of that kind to take on the sharpness, let alone the bitterness of tone, the great role sometimes requires. I certainly wouldn't want to be without it even so. Goodall's Isolde is Linda Esther Gray, and a fine one too. Linda Esther Gray there, in Isolde's love death at the end of the opera, with the Welsh National Opera Orchestra, gifted partners in a performance that takes its inspiration from a lifetime's devotion to Wagner in the person of Reginald Goodall. Then, in his 80th year, I come back, though, to Furtwängler, and to the recording which for so long has had the rather deadly weight of that tag classic, the classic version, round its neck. Let's be clear about it, it doesn't yield everything. There have been better Brangainers than Blanche Thiebaum, better Marks than Joseph Greindl. The Flagstad of 1952 isn't her younger self. Ludwig Zuthaus, the Tristan, isn't Melchior. But it's still a performance and a recording to warm the heart. And not so incidentally, it is Tristan and Isolde. And in Zuthaus, I'm increasingly convinced, as I hadn't used to be, that the noble Isolde has a Tristan worthy of her. And let's hear from Furtwängler how that passage from the love duet, which we heard with Bernstein, should really go.
The offstage warning the lovers didn't heed. Well, would you? Time for nights to give way to the day, and your presenter to give you some facts. The beautiful warning came from Brangainer, sung by Blanche Thiebaum. Ludwig Zuthaus was Tristan, and Kirsten Flagstad Isolde. Wilhelm Furtwängler conducted the Philharmonia Orchestra. And this 1952 mono recording comes at full price from EMI on 4 discs, with the number CDS 7473228. That was John Steane's central recommendation, but he wondered if you might be tempted by a different package of 2 recordings which complement each other, both on 3 discs, and both live. The earlier 1936 Flagstad with Melchior and the London Philharmonic, conducted by Fritz Reiner. That's again full price on Video Artists International, and the number is VAIA 10043. The distributor is Parsifal Distribution, should be easy enough to remember. Also the Carl Böhm recording, taped in stereo at the 1966 Bayreuth Festival with Wolfgang Wintergarten and Birgit Nilsson. That's at mid-price from Philips with the number 434422. And the Böhm, incidentally, is the only recording with a complete and uninterrupted act on each CD. At the beginning of the love scene in the second act, there are Isolde's famous lightning high Cs. How they were recorded in the Furtwängler set is almost as much a part of record history as the set itself. It seems that Flagstad was either afraid or possibly even incapable of singing them. So the young Elisabeth Schwarzkopf, wife of the set's producer Walter Legg, was on hand at the sessions to sing them instead. It was, in the opinion of rival Decca producer John Culshaw, a justifiable and well-executed trick. But when the story leaked, it became front-page news. The critics had a field day. Technical license had gone too far in its efforts to assist artistic endeavour, etc., etc.